Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar, happy faces out here today. My name is Doug Holland, and I was the faculty advisor for the Lemelson Honors Program this past year. So I am here to help kick the conference off. We're here today to honor and to showcase the independent research of our 2024 Anthropology Honors class. I want to begin by just saying a word about the program for some of you who may not be overly familiar with how we run it. This is a very unique and demanding undergraduate research program in which we ask students to develop an independent research project based around a topic of their own choosing. The program and the research is spread over 2 years, and it is grounded in a series of 5 integrated seminars in which we teach students how to write a research proposal, how to develop appropriate methods and obtain human subjects' permission to conduct the research that they want to do, how to analyze fieldwork data once it's been collected, how to write up the results of their research in a formal written thesis, and finally, how to present the results of their research in a variety of formats, some of which you're going to be able to see today. I want to emphasize how demanding the program is, how unusual it is. It's really very much the equivalent of a master's program because it's based on independent research and people need to write up their thesis. Many of these theses are very much the equivalent of the master's theses that are written in this program. So it's a very impressive body of research that we're going to be seeing today. With that short background, and before we move on to the research proposals themselves, there are a lot of people that we need to thank. A program like this depends on the goodwill and the energy of a lot of people. First and foremost, we want to thank Rob Lemelson, who's sitting right back here. Rob is a PhD graduate of our department. He is an adjunct professor of both anthropology and psychiatry here at UCLA. He is a distinguished visual psychological anthropologist, and he is the primary benefactor of this program. It is Rob's love of anthropology and his commitment to undergraduate education that has provided the resources that enable our students to conduct the really impressive research that we're about to see. I'm going to ask Rob up to say a few words in a minute, but before we go on, there are more people I need to thank. I want to thank Jason Troop, who I saw sneak in back here. He's the outgoing chair of the Department of Anthropology. I want to thank Omar Bohm, who has been the faculty advisor for the Lemelson program over the past several years. Both of these people have been very, very strong supporters of the program. I'd like to thank the instructors of the program over the past couple of years. Those include Professor Linda Garrow, Richard Legier, Heather Lloyd, Heather right in front of me, and Tricia Toyota. As well, I would like to thank all of the faculty in our department who have served as advisors for these students over the years. These committees are run just like we run a master's committee or a PhD committee. The students have to get professors who are willing to be their advisors and who consult with them over the course of their research. Almost everyone in our department has served as an advisor for a student in the Lemelson program over the past several years. So I want to thank all of the faculty and the anthropology who've supported the program. I've got to say a special word about the TAs in the program. I thought I saw Maddie. Yes, there's Maddie there. And Amelia Earhart, Homeback, they've both been the TAs for the program over the last couple of years. The students know how much they have depended on these TAs for intellectual support and every other kind of support you can imagine, almost on a daily, almost on an hourly basis. So we really couldn't do the work we do without the help of the TAs. So special thanks to Maddie and Amelia. Same thing, of course, goes for the anthropology staff in the department. An event like this cannot happen. Nothing happens in our department without the support and the time and energy of our staff. So very, very quickly, I would like to thank Kim, Army Ann, Tracy, Myrna D, Jennifer, Siva, Paul, and Drew for all of their help, not only for this event, but for everything that we do in the department. And finally, just another special word to both Heather and Amelia for all the work that they've put into this event, organizing this conference. So with that, as background, Rob, would you like to come up and say a few words before we get started?
Thanks, Doug, and welcome everyone, and particularly welcome to the parents who supported your students to get to this point. So I give you guys a round of applause. So this program, there was an honors program, and I think the students have heard this little piece of the talk in the past, but I think in 2008, 2009, in the wake of the whole kind of economic meltdown during that period, funding left, and there was no honors program. And you know, UCLA is one of the best anthropology departments in the world, and to not have an honors program, I thought was was unfortunate. And so I worked with then Chair Carol Browner, and I thought back to my undergraduate experience. I was really lucky to go to a kind of experimental college, Hampshire College, which was started in the 70s, no grades, no required courses. But the best part of the Hampshire education is you had a year to do a thesis. And students did theses all you know, in all different areas. I chose anthropology, but what I didn't have at that point was really the prep that this program does, because there's 2 quarters of prep before the field work, and then students have done field work just for particularly for the parents all over the world, in Tanzania, in Brazil, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. Just like, it's really remarkable. So far in now this is the 13th or 14th year, it's been a long haul. Every single student has been remarkable and successful, and many of them have gone on to like really interesting careers, some in anthropology, some in other disciplines. But I think this lays the foundation, this program, for people becoming independent and impactful scholars, because the research is on this. We'll see. I'm not going to presage it, but there's just really remarkable projects this year, as there are every year. So, so you know, anthropology is this kind of, you know, alone in some ways among the sciences, among the social sciences. There's this commitment in anthropology that is grounded in field work, in going to a different place in a different language, not always, but usually, for an extended period of time, and really getting involved in both the issues, but most importantly, the relationships with your originally subjects, participants, and later on friends. I've been doing now field work for 30 years in Indonesia, and some of the most remarkable and closest people in my life are the people I've worked with in the field. So this is the start, and people have gotten a great start to this place in anthropology where you can reach across these boundaries of time and space and language and gender and education and ability and politics, and you can make these connections that are like these deeply meaningful and really beautiful connections. And I think that everyone who's done their work, all the graduating seniors. We will see that today. So congratulations, everyone. And I would, again, the thanks have already been done. Doug was my dissertation chair, so he's obviously, I wouldn't be here without Doug. But I'd like to particularly, and then, Heather and all the faculty and staff, I'd like to particularly thank Jason Throop, who I was in graduate school with, who was a phenomenal chair and one of the most positive and deeply thought and strongest supporters of this program. And this program is the way it is now because of Jason's deep commitment and dedication and positive feelings and support. So I'd like to give Jason one more round of applause. Okay. So here we go.
Okay, here we go. Hello, Lemelson scholars, past and present, faculty, Lemelson TAs, UCLA alumni, family, and peers. Welcome to our 2024 Lemelson Anthropological Undergraduate Honors Conference. And okay, first, thanks to you all for being here, both in person and on Zoom. We are extremely grateful for your support today. And so I just want to first start. Senior cohort, can you please stand up and turn around? I want to start by saying congratulations for producing such meaningful, incredible work. And I want to thank each of you for your passionate dedication to producing excellence in undergraduate anthropological research. Okay, you can sit down. It might take a while. Like several cohorts before them, they have had to deal with a lot of uncertainty in one way or another, and over their time in the program, and these scholars have persevered. In the end, they have put their hearts and their souls into their projects, which is quite evident in the work that they have produced, and I couldn't be more proud of what they have accomplished. Today, we'll do a Q&A to discuss students' pre-recorded presentations that you've... Can we mute everybody on there? Sorry. Okay, today we'll do a Q&A to discuss their pre-recorded presentations that you have viewed ahead of the conference, instead of presenting their research live through, say, PowerPoint presentations. This allows us to delve deeper into the students' research projects and hear more from them about their findings and their process. Interesting. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. And we've also found that having the culmination of all of their hard work over the last few years forever documented in a 10-minute, maybe a little more, recording is really valuable. And I'm excited to hear all of your questions and comments that emerge from viewing and thinking about the scholars' research stories. Okay, so for today, we're going to have students receive questions and comments one by one. They'll first introduce them. We're going to have them come up in groups. They're going to introduce themselves and their projects briefly, and then we'll have the audience raise their hand, either physically or on Zoom. And you can also write a question in the chat for those on Zoom, and we can call on you that way too. Each student will get about 8 minutes for their Q&A, and we have 11 students total. Amelia, our wonderful TA, will be keeping time for us, and she'll also let us know when we have the last question is up. Okay, so let's get the show started. First group up. Can we please have Deanna, Izzy, and Jen come up to the table? Okay, first up, we're going to have Deanna, and her presentation is called Lo que pasa en la casa, How Latinx Immigrant Communities Navigate Cultural and Structural Barriers When Seeking Mental Health Care in Los Angeles. Okay, so now who has a question for Deanna? All right, Clarissa.
Hi, Deanna, like all the way back here. So in your presentation, you met with 3 women, right?
I met with who?
3 women.
3 women.
Yes.
And all of them were immigrants to the United States. How did you see how gender also played into what their mental health kind of was like as well? Because you had a lot of things on immigration and class and status, but gender is also a super important part of it. And I wanted you to let more of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Gender does play a big role. I mean, to begin with, the selection of my participants wasn't only open to female, but they are the ones that were available. But in looking at their stories, yeah, there are some overlap issues with gender and expectations, as well as, you know, potential violence and exposure to kind of like these beliefs and ideas about what their roles should be for their communities and in their homes. So that's the beauty of this project or of doing research, is that, you know, you come in with an idea of what you might see, but then when you start analyzing the data, you start realizing that there are overlap themes, and one of them was gender expectations, gender roles, and how they impact mental health.
And I forgot to ask you to briefly just remind people what you studied.
Yeah, so my work is focused on using the person-centered methodology to provide a more qualitative approach to understanding how Latinx immigrant patients in particularly the Spanish-speaking psychosocial clinic navigate their health and well-being. And it's person-centered because, you know, when compared to a lot of the data that is more like quantitative surveys, you know, rating scales, etc., I went to their homes. I wanted to document about their lives physically, where their spaces, where they live, eat, breathe, and also to get a more nuanced idea about their interactions with their community, with their family, and you know, and the possibility that is not really afforded in mental health care because you know, at this time, the way that things are going, it's like you see a patient next, and, you know, that's it. And it's unfortunate because there are a lot of dedicated mental health providers that want to do good work, but they're being pushed by this economic system that's making them just kind of like in and out, in and out. So I wanted to open the doors to their homes, literally, and say, listen, you're missing out on these things. And it's not that easy to say this patient is X, Y, or Z. Let's look at bigger and deeper things.
I guess.
So I was hoping you could say another word about your own background as a medical translator, how that may have generated some of your interests, and you've just touched on the difference in perspective between you as an anthropologist and some of the clinicians that you work with in the clinic, and what you might be able to bring to them to
Yeah.
help them.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so my background is that I went into community mental health about 12 years ago as a medical interpreter initially. Eventually, I started my work in a psychiatric administrative office, managing kind of all the day-to-day activities of a psychiatric office. And, you know, in the San Fernando Valley, the majority of the patients there were Latino, monolingual. And so being in the sessions during the time where we were facing immigration raids, COVID, and all these different things that came on, it became evident that, you know, as much as clinicians wanted to do their best, that there was some like some things that were getting missed. Sometimes even just in the communication or the expectation of how to get better. So that in itself has always been like in the back of my mind. Aside from my own navigating as a Mexican immigrant, as I stated in my video, I'm a Mexican immigrant, so I knew also from experience kind of like that there's a lot of things that don't get seen, and that, you know, unfortunately, with this idea that it's the patient's fault that they're not getting better. It's kind of like, no, I think we need to switch it up and say, no, what is going on that we're not looking at more deeply? So that's how I got involved. And, you know, some of it was also serendipitous because I had my own health scare. So it just kind of expanded my curiosity of like, what is going on with the healthcare system and how can we provide a voice for these families? Yes.
Hello. So proud of you. I'm Erica Loveliner, psychiatrist, Latina psychiatrist, and director of the Spanish-speaking psychosocial clinic, and more importantly, you know, a mentor to Diana. Diana, you know, there's people up, you know, on Zoom and here, and some of us have accessed mental health ourselves, but why is it so important for mental health professionals to do a home visit? Maybe not every visit, obviously, but once, at least in the course of treatment. And in particular, if you want to take it a step further, why visit a Latino home?
Yeah, again, it kind of ties back to this idea that care should not be cookie cutter. It shouldn't be kind of like if you have this, then take this, and that's it, and it's solved. I think in general, care should understand the patient's environment, the social determinants of health. But for the Latino patient, the Latino immigrant patient, we have a whole set of layers that include cultural beliefs, structural barriers with language as well. And something as simple as, you know, going to these patients' homes and seeing where they sleep, where they eat, where they purchase their food. You know, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't there to, you know, get their business out there, like out of, you know, for shame, but to say, listen, providers, you need to understand that it's not the same thing to ask a patient to go take a walk and feel better if you're talking about a patient that has been assaulted in the bus stop a street away from here, or that it's not safe, or that there's really no green areas around. Let's talk about where these people live. How can we really inform ourselves about their living conditions so that we can provide more realistic and also not only care that is only about curing the symptoms, but also, you know, linking them to resources and all these other things that are part of our well-being as well.
One last question.
If no one has a question, I have one.
Oh.
Go.
You were admitted to the PhD program here, and congratulations.
Red.
I'm really curious as to whether you plan to expand on this project, and if so, how, and if not, where do you plan to go with your research?
Yeah, so expect a sequel. Yeah, I do want to expand it. I want to, you know, it's really hard to do this work in a limited amount of time. So I'm looking forward to visiting more patients, to analyzing more and more kind of families' realities, and, you know, bring in more of that question that Clarissa asked about, like, where does gender play a role? Because the reality is that immigration status, language competency, gender, and all these other aspects, it's a mosaic. It's not like one line fits everybody the same way. So I want to figure out how to, you know, incorporate that in my research for the PhD. Good question.
Thanks, Diana. Okay, next we have Izzy, and everyone please project your voices. Okay, Izzy, her presentation is called Taking Control of My Health, Undergraduate Students Navigating the Transition from Pediatric to Adult Care. Izzy, can you state your name and then just tell us a little bit about your project?
Yes, so I'm Izzy Lazar, and I investigated how students at UCLA, undergraduate students at UCLA, who are enrolled in the UC's health insurance program, which cuts the cost of seeing a doctor, how they experience their health-seeking needs and what their health-seeking behaviors are like, and how they are influenced by the family.
Okay, first question. Clarissa again.
I'm very interested in the story of your participant who had thyroid cancer. So I know that you interviewed other participants as well as him, but what was one of the most striking patterns that you saw throughout the entire process of this, accessibility to healthcare, even though people have musician? Was there a pattern?
So in direct relation to Jonathan who had thyroid cancer, or just across the board? That's what you're
Across the
asking.
board.
Okay, across the board. Yeah, so there were a few things that came up. Students really utilized it for taboo health subjects that they weren't comfortable taking care of on their own at home. So this health insurance program was entirely up to them to take over. There were also a lot of relational narratives of health, of how these students are thinking about their health, who else they're thinking about in that time. Introspective learning, which was Jonathan's main finding, was you can only really learn by doing in some of these situations. And then there was also a large pattern, no matter if the primary caregiver in the situation was still part of the student's life or not so much anymore, they still thought about this primary caregiver. And when I say primary caregiver, I mean the person who helped raise them and was in control of their health for most of their life. So it's typically a mom. And so no matter how close they still were with their family, those ideas and those things that they learned growing up, they're still influencing how students today take care of their health. But it's not always in a linear pattern. Some students take those findings with them and move through like in the same way that they were raised, and others completely do a complete 180 and try to figure things out on their own.
Okay, next question. And Zoom, we're looking out for you too. Yes.
So, I was really surprised with the format you took with this video initially because there wasn't any visuals. I thought I would have trouble following along, but I ended up being incredibly attentive to what you were saying. So I kind of want some background as to how you decided to choose a podcast-like format for this. I know that the topic of your presentation was a bit sensitive, it deals with health issues, so I want to know if that had any role in how you chose this format or why.
Yeah, so I did choose podcast format. I was the only one in the cohort to do that this year, and exactly what you're saying. I felt strange trying to find any visuals that could go with the story I was telling, and I hadn't recorded anything besides audio recordings when I was speaking with my participants. So it just felt a little funny to try and find stock videos to go with it. So I went the podcast route, and thank you to Georgia for being my host.
Yeah, the students can do any format. They can choose any format they want to tell their story. I think there was another question. Yes.
In the first question, you talked about a lot about the closeness that people have with their primary caregiver growing up. Was that an expectation or a question you had going into the project, or did that kind of emerge as you were interviewing your participants?
It was a question I had going into the project. Initially, I was focused on what influence the family had over students' health while they were here at university, while the family was physically elsewhere. So that was my main question going in. But as I was interviewing people, I found that it's not just the family, it's the friends around them, their roommates who they aren't necessarily friends with, their coworkers. Everybody here in this new environment is also influencing them.
Could you say a little bit more about your sampling? Who was responding? Who do you think might not have been responding?
Right. So I actually talked a bit about this with my mom when it was first happening, but I think a lot of the people who responded to my sampling had stories to share because it was set up as a health behaviors kind of study. So many of my participants did have a more detailed, intricate story or like family history with health, which I think was helpful for my findings, but I only had a handful of students who were only using the health insurance program for like very minute things, like a cold or anything like that. Yeah, I think.
I'd love for those, if there's no other questions, I'd love you to talk about like the end of your podcast and like what are some things we should be thinking about.
Oh, right. So you could really go two ways with the findings of the study. You could argue that everything is going well the way it is, and students need this safe place where they aren't worrying about costs to kind of explore what routes they could take with their healthcare and learn to figure things out now before they're in a situation where they no longer have access to healthcare or they feel even more alone outside of the university setting. But at the same time, you could look at this and you could look at all of the financial modules that the school offers, different training sources that the school has to raise a certain level of educational awareness on these kind of life skill things. And there can be an argument for having that kind of module training course for different routes of health seeking. And you can also say that there should be maybe a support line or something, because there were some participants who went through many of their struggles on their own. They didn't feel like they had anybody to talk to, so something anonymous like that. So the university could definitely offer more support for students who have this health insurance.
We have time for one more question. And I have one. It was really nice to hear from Dr. Beth Bromley. She's a wonderful person and she asks the very best questions. And one of the things that she was talking about was future directions for your projects. I'm curious about where you plan to head with this in the future, if at all, or if you feel like you've sort of gotten out of it what you wanted.
No, I would definitely love to learn a lot more about what's going on. And I think a great way of doing that would be a longitudinal study, tracking students from their freshman year up until their graduation year and seeing how things change over time, who influences them most at which points. And of course, it's not going to be linear, it fluctuates, it ebbs and flows, but I think that would be a really great study to pursue if I had more time.
Yeah. We hope you do. Okay, thank you, Izzy. Okay, next up we have Jennifer, or Jen, we like to call her. It takes a village, the importance of community for immigrant Vietnamese families raising children with autism spectrum disorder.
So hello.
Jen, yeah, can you, sorry, you were already going. Go ahead and talk about your project a little bit.
Okay, so hello, my name is Jen, and for my project, I guess for my project, I wanted to look at the experiences of immigrant Vietnamese families and how they were raising children with autism, and specifically from the conversations I was able to have with them through our semi-structured interviews was that they really depend on their physical community spaces, even though there is perceived stigma, because they found a sense of place.
Great. Okay, first question for Jen. Okay, Derek, hi.
Hi, Jen. First of all, I think you're doing the video you did and the what you talked about is really interesting. I would like to ask about, you talked about how these mothers who have kids on the spectrum, they found support by talking to each other, and then they found support also by developing all these kinds of they gather together in this community, they have this common situation that they can talk about. So I would also like to ask a little bit, because you touched on the idea of Confucianism and this sort of role for children or for kids and their obligation to parents in this culture. So I'd like to ask about whether or not if you also found examples where this Vietnamese culture, if you will, or rather that these people also face like issues in terms of reconciling this expectation of their children versus the reality that they're facing right now, and what is it like for them to have to balance those two, and do they have to pick and choose, or do they have to develop something new out of it?
Thank you for your question. So all of my families, I interviewed around 10 families. One of the families, I talked to the mom, and she's a little bit different from the other families I interviewed, because of the other families, they talked a lot about things like stigma, from karma, and from like the family obligations that cause stigma, because now their children can't carry out all of these obligations. But for her, she was able to have an American education here, so it was a lot easier for her to understand a lot of these, I guess, medical explanations for why her child had autism. And from that, she kind of spent a lot of time, I guess, trying to push her two sons, who both had autism, to kind of figure out ways to best take care of themselves. So right now, one of them is 15 and the other one's 18. So one just graduated high school and the other one is still in high school. But she talked a lot about how she taught them to do things like ride the bus, to drive themselves, to like cook for themselves, and all of these things with supervision. And now they've like slowly gained a greater independence. And with that, I guess it connects to your question, because for her, she talked a lot about how she believed that they and autistic children should be able to like eventually gain independence, because I guess this comes from her own worry about what would happen when she passes away, which is also another worry that a lot of the other families had. And with that, she pushed them to have this independence, so they would be able to like eventually care for themselves after she passes. But I guess again, this worry and the stigma for these parents I was able to interview just comes from like a general fear of what would happen after no one can take care of their child. And at the end of the day, they kind of just want the best for their child.
I have a question about one of the conclusions you had in your video, which is kind of developing culturally sensitive spaces for Vietnamese American families. And I wanted to ask about this idea of like culturally sensitive, I think in both Anna's presentation for Latino Americans in the medical system, and also how the medical system diagnoses autism. There isn't that ability to capture the diaspora of Asian experiences from both the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, East Asia. So I guess in your video, why was it so important to emphasize the uniqueness of the Vietnamese American experience and to create those culturally sensitive spaces?
I guess with that, there are a lot of studies that looked at how culture could play a role in whether or not families of different cultures can interpret and like follow through with like a diagnosis of autism. And a lot of those studies found that culture plays a really big role in like whether or not families are able to perceive whether or not their children are presenting autism symptoms. And that leads into a whole other area of like whether or not they take them to the doctors, whether or not they go into interventions and different therapies. And I went into that conclusion because a lot of the families I interviewed, they talked very fondly of these community spaces they found, whether or not they do talk about like autism in those spaces or not. And I think having these spaces where people are able to talk about autism, talk about their experiences raising a child with autism, again goes into what I said in the video, where it can really normalize the experience of having a child with autism, since these families felt like it's something that's very stigmatized. So having these spaces will normalize it, would allow them to feel more empowered, to have, I guess, a more hopeful future, since they also had a lot of fears about what the future meant.
I'm really interested. I apologize that I didn't watch the video, but I will. I happen to also be a child adolescent psychiatrist, and what I find in Latino communities is that the acceptance of the diagnosis, so there's one to get diagnosed and have the awareness, but once the family has a diagnosis, I find that for Latinos, like, it takes like maybe 2 or 3 psychiatrists, visiting 2 or 3 psychiatrists to have that acceptance. And I'm wondering if you found something similar, and what kind of played into the, what helped families accept the diagnosis?
So a good portion of my the interviewees I was able to interview kind of are still in the process of feeling a little unsure about their child's diagnosis, even though they are like 15, 28 years into like the process of knowing whether or not their child has autism. And from the families who did find acceptance and feel a lot better about where their child is at and how they're caring for their child, it seems like it's just these personal connections of like knowing other Vietnamese mothers who have a child with autism. And those families, again, they like talk really fondly about the relationships they have with these other mothers and these other families, and they feel a lot more comfortable with doing things like, oh, like, it'll be okay because this family is okay and this child is okay.
That's beautiful.
Okay, if there's no more questions,
Hi. I noticed that you're referring to them as these autistic individuals as like more like individuals with autism, and I know that among the like autistic individuals that I know personally, identity first language is like really important to them. So they typically prefer, or identify as autistic individuals as opposed to individuals with autism. And I'm wondering if, the language you're using is intentional, or if that came up in like your interview, that came up among your participants at all, or and if it did, and this is an intentional choice, like if that has anything to do with the stigma that you're talking about?
Okay, so I just want to say sorry because in my video I did say that I would do identity first language, and I guess when I do look at the data, a lot of these parents and siblings use person first language, and I guess I'm still kind of like stuck with transitioning between those two. But yeah, I definitely would, in general, I would use for identity first language.
That's interesting. Did you find any like connections to that stigma, like in terms of like how they prefer to like identify that diagnosis like within themselves? You know what I mean?
So I specifically interviewed mothers and siblings of autistic siblings. So for them, it does come with like stigma, because I guess this is another interesting point of what I found in the past literature. Vietnam just recently, like in the last couple of years, recognized autism as a disorder instead of just a disease. So with that, these families are still, I guess, undergoing the process of understanding like autism isn't something that they can change or anything they can do to change it. And so when they say, oh, my child with autism, they're still they still see those two things as kind of different, because I guess another thing I found was that I didn't include in the video was that whenever I asked these parents to kind of describe their children, and whenever they initially describe their children, they would say, oh, like, they're really lively, or they're very, they just use very positive words. And then when I went into a question like, oh, like, how do you feel knowing that your child is autistic? And they go into these more negative phrases when they associate these two things together. And I guess that goes into why they choose child with autism instead of my autistic child.
Super interesting. Thank you for sharing.
and we have one, Sakina, you can come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, so I was wondering, like, We talked a lot about the parents' perceptions of their kids. Did you happen, like I don't know how old the kids were, but did you happen to get any of their perceptions of themselves or in relation to their parents? Just like that, like was that something that was possible?
That wasn't possible just because I guess initially when I went into this project, I kind of wasn't even sure if these families would kind of respond to me. And a lot of these interviewees, they kind of only were open to participating in these interviews because my mom knew someone with an autistic child, and they knew someone else with an autistic child. And
Yeah.
I guess also this goes into when I was talking to these mothers and these children, or these siblings, at least how they were describing it, they were saying that their autistic sibling would be a little unable to participate in these interviews themselves. So I kept my research to specifically these mothers and these other siblings, since another part of this was that I felt like family perceptions and family culture plays a really big role in how the rest of an autistic child's life would go. So I thought it would be important to specifically look at that.
Cool. Thank you for answering my question.
Thanks for your question, and thank you guys for. Okay, we're gonna switch it up. Aiden, Emily, let's go. All right. Okay, first up, we're going to hear from Aiden. And his project is called Examining Ceramic Standardization at Hispanic Period Bonbon Church, Camarines Sur, Philippines. All right, Aiden, can you tell us about your research?
So yeah, the title doesn't really capture what I've done fully, but really what my project was about was looking at how ceramic standardization and production organization at Bonbon Church specifically changed during the early modern period, very specifically looking at the Spanish colonial period. And I think, in brief, the main thing that I observed with the data that we were able to collect so far is that production organization changes very little, and it stays relatively consistent over a period of 300 or so years. What we think.
Okay, first question for Aiden. Derek in the back.
It's a general question about the time period that you're working with. I know you said that the site was inhabited from about late 14th century onwards. So, in terms of the ceramics you're working with, what is the time span?
That's a great question. It's hard to know exactly what the time span is because a lot of this dating is based on the stratigraphy, and the stratigraphy is not perfect, but I think estimates anywhere between 15th century to 19th century. When I was selecting samples, I knew that the highest and the very lowest stratigraphy would probably be less accurate, so I tried to take from the middle there. And I think if I had to estimate, I'd say roughly between 1500 to 1800. Like I said, the construction of the church was in 1807, I believe. So when I kind of stopped at the levels that were probably most likely associated with that construction. And the same thing, I also didn't take from levels that we knew were associated with the 14th century material. So yeah, that's the rough time frame.
Maddie.
Okay. Hey, Aiden. I have a couple of questions, actually. So the first one is not my question. It's from Dr. Cabato, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And his question is if you can share kind of your thoughts about the transition from the pre-Hispanic to the colonial period, since you said there didn't seem to be much change. Like, what are some of your thoughts about like what was going on and maybe why you got the type of results that you saw?
Right. Honestly, it's very hard to say. So something that I talk about a lot in the video and in my thesis is that very complicated. You know, archaeology is not a perfect science. It's not like we can just look and obviously you know, but we can't just look and know what's happening. But I think probably one of the biggest things that we should probably think about is how we perceive complexity, like social complexity. Because as you know, right, you were at the site. There's a lot going on that site. It was obviously inhabited for a very long period of time. And yes, it's true that we don't see, like, traditional models would generally posit, you know, over time, social complexity rises, social organization becomes more centralized, and then specialization leads to more specialized products. But there are just a lot of cases where that's not true. I think something similar is probably happening at Bon Bon Church, right? When we look at traditional models of specialization, they follow very, I don't want to say, like, idealized ideas of how we think people act. But then realistically, obviously, especially during the Spanish colonial period, there are so many different factors that are complicating this analysis, right? You have population movement in Bicol itself. You have population decline in Bicol itself. You have, you know, how do the people at this site choose to produce their ceramics? Are they making them in this style intentionally as like an expression of their cultural identity? Or is this related, like how does this relate to larger trade patterns? Again, something that I brought up is that in other regions, specialization is really, really important because it allows for the like intensive production of completed goods that they can then trade with other people and other communities for things that they don't have direct access to. Obviously, during the Spanish colonial period, you know, a lot of these systems are being challenged, and a lot of new systems are coming up. And so I think that really what the results from Bon Bon Church indicate is that, you know, there's a very wide range of responses that people had to colonialism. You know, every community was making decisions, and they were decisions, right? They had agency, and they knew what they were doing, and they were making decisions, even if they didn't know it at the time, based on the information that they had and what they could do. And I think it's important to look at narratives that highlight their agency instead of just looking at like cause and effect type things.
Thank you. Can I ask a second question? So this is my question. As you said, I was in the field with you and your project changed a lot, and we often say in archaeology, like anything that can go wrong probably will go wrong. And can you talk a little bit about your process of developing your question, and maybe like were there other things you wanted to explore that you couldn't, or that you would like to explore in the future, because you're also an incoming PhD student at University of Oregon this year. Is there something else you would like to explore either at this site that you couldn't this time, or what directions maybe would you take if you could redo the project? If things could go 100% right, how would you do that?
Right. I think to answer your first question, yeah, so initially my project was very different. I wanted to look at chemical analysis of ceramics using the PXRF. It didn't end up working out. I actually brought that machine to the Philippines. It didn't work. And so in the field, I had to kind of adapt and lean more heavily into the morphological analysis. But honestly, I don't think, if I had the chance to redo it, yeah, maybe I'd want the PXRF to work, but I think this was a very valuable experience. I think I definitely have an interest in working in Bicol long term. I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to work in the Philippines. I think that it's not an opportunity that a lot of people get. And I also think that the mentors and the teachers that I've had, so Dr. Acabado, yourself, and Earl Hernandez, I think you guys have been very formative in the way that I approach archaeology. And I think this project has been very formative in the way that I approach archaeology and what my goals are. And what I'm interested in. So I don't think I'd change, if I had the chance to do it again, I don't think I'd change anything. Going forward, I think I'm probably going to lean more heavily into environmental archaeology, because those are just the questions that interest me the most. But that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy my time doing this work.
And did you have a question back there? Last question.
You briefly mentioned that one of the samples, or I don't really understand if it was like the time period of the samples or some of the samples, the ceramics were being created for individual use or for their own use. And then after the Spaniards came, they started being used for trade, if I'm understanding that correct. Who, like, based on your research, why the change, and was the trade with the colonizers, or was it with the locals?
Hi, Mom. I think there might be a misunderstanding. There may be some misunderstanding about. I actually had, if I had to make a statement, it would actually be the reverse. I think it was more likely that they were involved more heavily in trade prior to Spanish colonization than after Spanish colonization. Trade got a lot more complicated. I'm not going to say it stopped, but it definitely got more complicated. I know that in other regions of the Philippines, trade continued, obviously, because you see, right, you have very obvious signs that there's porcelain coming from China, there's trade goods coming from all the way from like Mexico or Europe that are making their way into the Philippines. It's just that at this site in particular, a lot of the trade or prestige goods that we see are associated almost entirely with I don't want to say pre-Hispanic, but the very earliest context that we have. And then after that, you don't see, I'm not going to say you don't see any, but like the proportion of like tradeware to like earthenware ceramics that were probably made for domestic use like changes drastically. I apologize if it wasn't clear in that video.
All right. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Aiden. Okay, next up we have Emily. And soy dueña de mi tiempo. How women in Antigua, Guatemala become owners of their time and money through street food vending. And I'd also like to say that I just found out that Emily won the Dean's Prize for Excellence in research and creativity at University Research Week, and I'm very proud. We're so excited about that.
Thank you.
Okay, Emily, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure. My name is Emily, and last summer I got the opportunity to go to Guatemala for 2 months, and I lived with a host family in Antigua, and during my time there, I spent countless hours doing participant observation, shadowing street food vendors, and working in the marketplace. And through interviews and documentary photography, which you're welcome to look through in a little album over there, along with some memorabilia and good Guatemalan snacks. So I got to learn about the challenges and the aspirations of street food vendors. I focused on women because they were the majority of street food vendors, but I was also interested in family economics of what was leading them to start their businesses, and also the relationships between Catholicism and indigeneity and the colonial architecture that influenced the social environment in Antigua. So if you have any questions.
Yes, we'll open up for questions. Okay, yes.
So I know it's been built for a lot of the projects that focus their studies abroad, but specifically Guatemala interests me because, you know, it has this very long and extensive history of U.S. intervention and outside colonialism, and I want to know specifically with the project that works so closely with the people there, how do you kind of maintain, you know, like, how's your approach to this that remains respectful to the indigenous peoples, but also, you know, builds integral connections with them, you know? How do you balance between trying to not become a colonial force, but also to build relationships that are meaningful with your subjects?
Yeah, for
This
sure.
is something that interests me as well, if I ever decide to do research like this.
I think you have to think a lot about your positionality and what values and talents and aspects of your own identity you can bring to the research while still valuing how different your participants are in their living circumstances. And so as a woman myself and being really good with kids, I thought I could connect with these mothers in a certain way that would help them out. And I also think my whole project was about showcasing their voices and hearing what they had to say. So I wasn't ever guiding their responses. And I also spent a lot of time learning about the history of Guatemala through classes in the Chicano Studies department. And while I was down in Guatemala, I went to multiple museums for like indigenous genocide and for like the just different like cultural museums and talking with people. So I tried to learn as much as I could like while I was down there. Yeah.
Christina.
Christina.
So you had mentioned that a lot of the women that sold, what are they called?
Yeah, sweets.
Their sweets.
Yeah.
It contributed to their children's education.
Mhm.
And with the rising costs of the ingredients and them not charging more, was there sort of like a reflection in what they could provide for their kids or the education you receive? And also, is the education like local or outside of Guatemala?
It's not in Antigua most of the time. Most of the time when people are going to pursue higher education, they go to Guatemala City, which is the capital. So like the dichotomy of it was that these mothers were telling their children like study so you don't do the same as me, like go, I'll help you, like I'll provide for you to continue education, but at the same time they were like enlisting their children to help out in the business and in that process teaching them and continuing the heritage which the street food preserves. But yeah, they were putting their money towards helping them pursue higher education. The issue with that is because of the job market, even when students gotten their university degree, it's not like there's jobs for them to take, and so that's why a lot of the street food vendors that I interviewed were also teachers or also nurses and had different roles in the community, but this was like their supplemental income for the extra things like tuition. I thought it was very interesting at the Spanish school I attended. The teachers would bring batches of tamales or other food when they had a special occasion that they needed to like fundraise for, like for example a graduation or a birthday, and I thought it was really inspiring, the reciprocity between the teachers but also in the neighborhood, how they would all like take care of each other when they knew that each other needed help through this buying and selling process. Yeah.
Derek, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Actually, kind of related to the previous question, which is that you mentioned how women, by doing this street vending, gain agency.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could provide some examples of perhaps how this agency is gained, in what ways would women who have this sort of independent source of income be able to exercise that agency within the context of women's work?
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea. A couple of my participants were older, and so they stopped their regular job because of the time and the commitment that the housekeeping job required, and by having their own entrepreneur business within their own home, they're able to manage their maternal responsibilities of managing the house, but also like having a almost passive income, because it's like there are a lot of the signs in my video say just like knock or ring the doorbell, and so they can be doing other things, so they give a little bit more agency over their time than a regular like 9-to-5 job. And then it gives more agency over their finances, because a lot of the times when a Guatemalan woman is married, sometimes she doesn't work and instead receives an allowance each month from her husband, and the allowance is from the husband's salary, but it's not all of it, and if the allowance doesn't cover what they need, like the family's left trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And so this is where street food comes in as a like socially acceptable way of earning money, but the money can be solely for like the woman to spend, but she often chooses to spend it on her family because of the values of Marianismo. Yeah.
Okay, do we have time for one more? One more. Clarissa.
So I can't help but think for this project about like restaurant chains like McDonald's and Chipotle or whatever.
Mhm.
Did you see that encroachment in Antigua?
Mhm.
And if so, is it threatening their way of life that you could tell, or you know, what's kind of the dynamics of that?
Yeah, so in my presentation, I showed a map that I did showing the spatial environment of Antigua and where the street food vendors are located. And also in my presentation, I referenced some of the municipal code, which like prohibits street food vendors, especially in the commercialized central tourist area, which is like the Plaza Central mostly. So like 1 block off the Center Park, there is a McDonald's, and they say it's the most beautiful McDonald's ever because it's in a colonial house and you can see volcanoes from the patio. So it is gorgeous, but there's also Taco Bells and Subways, but they're all concentrated in the center of town. And of course, they wouldn't prefer to have street food vendors out front of their establishment. And so that's one of the reasons that street food vendors are a lot more prevalent in local neighborhoods, near bus stops and parks and stuff, because they are majoritarily serving the local residents over the tourists.
Okay, thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
And next we have Brizeda. Her project is called Cultural Resistance, Experiences of Maintaining Identity Among the Yoreme in Northern Sinaloa, Mexico. All right, can you tell us a little bit about your project?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Brizeda Alvarez Arana, and I looked at the current challenges an indigenous community in Sinaloa, Mexico are currently facing. The name of the group is Yoreme Mayo, and I specifically focused on how their everyday cultural practices are basically a form of resistance against the current presence of settler colonialism within their community.
All right, and make sure you project when you.
Okay.
I couldn't even hear you. Okay. All right, first question for Brizeda. Diana.
Brizeda, I just want to say that I'm really, I've already said this before, but I'm really proud of the work that you've done. I'm curious about how your kind of your ability to demonstrate the value of culture has also informed the people around you, like your family or your community. Do you see, a different appreciation for the Yoreme in your community? Because it's a community that you come from as well. So I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, so I actually shared what I wrote with my mom about the video. So I feel like it kind of also informed her a little bit about the current situation with indigenous people. So I feel like it definitely has kind of like made other people aware of what indigenous peoples face in Mexico. I guess specifically for me, also just because going into the field, you get like a very different experience from simply just like watching the video. When you're in the community, you see more of what's going on. So I feel like, it definitely did.
You just mentioned other indigenous groups in Mexico, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more from a comparative point of view. Are the problems very similar with other indigenous groups? Some of the political issues you mentioned in the video, is there any of that that's particular to the group that you were working with?
I feel like I have read similar literature that kind of where other indigenous groups in Mexico are facing somewhat similar issues. I did read about the indigenous group in Chiapas, and I feel like it's similar but not exactly the same, just because I feel like every indigenous group faces their own challenges. But I think specifically with the Yoreme, it's more kind of a little bit different, just because you see these Mexican political parties, and I feel like with
the indigenous group in Chiapas, it's a little bit different.
And so we have a few people online, so I'm going to call on. First, we have Ivana. Do you want you wrote a comment? Would you like to come online, or would you like us to read the comment?
That's okay. I can talk about it. So, as a fellow Mexican student who grew up in Mexico, your comments about the erasure of indigenous cultures really resonated. Because even growing up in Mexico, I didn't really get the chance to learn about indigenous cultures well over there. And so, to that point, I think that it could be argued that Mexican indigenous roots have been sort of ignored or suppressed from the Mexican, I guess, cultural consciousness, you could say. And so I'm interested to know from your research and from your experiences while doing it, if you have any suggestions or if you reflected in any way how, as Mexican people, we can kind of heal this relationship with our general indigenous roots that have been ignored and suppressed for so long.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think for me it was very similar. I kind of mentioned this in my video. I didn't really get to learn about indigenous culture until I was in college, and I took my first Chicano course. It's very interesting because Mexican culture is very deeply rooted in indigenous culture. So I feel like it's just everywhere. So I feel like reading reading helps a lot, kind of figuring out where this type of culture comes from. I feel like there's also a lot of videos on YouTube where you can kind of also inform yourself about the different cultures that there is out there. And just little small things like that. I think also just asking questions about other people's cultures can also help kind of inform us more about the different cultures that are out there in regards with indigenous people's cultures.
Great. And we have Linda Garo, who has a question.
Oh, thank you so much for your video and presentation, I guess. Oh, here I'm showing, yeah. My question has to do with your very interesting discussion of the Yori. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about who these individuals are. Do they identify as Yoreme? And does this link up to that discussion you had about the political parties and their intrusion? And I just wanted to know a bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the Yori is basically, the Yoreme consider a Yori someone who does not respect the tradition of the Yoreme. So it's kind of interesting because the Yoreme live within other Yoris. So Yoris and Yoremes live in the same community. And you can think of a Yori as a mestizo, and a mestizo is basically someone who is been a mestizo is basically someone who has indigenous who's been mixed with an indigenous person and Spaniard, and that's what mestizo is. So you can say that these political parties are Yoris just because they're outsiders. And they're, even though they live within the community and they see the different aspects of the Yoreme culture, they don't really understand exactly what the Yoreme are practicing. So the only ones who really understand what their cultural practices are the Yoreme.
Thank you. And Victoria is next online.
Hi, hey Priscilla. I'm sorry to be here today. So my question is probably not going to be any surprise in focusing more on the food aspect of your project. And so really my question is just if you could elaborate on any specifics in terms of were there certain meals or cuisines or recipes that you saw that maybe were only used in ceremonies, or in what way did you see food show as sort of as an act of resistance, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, so I mentioned a specific type of food that's called wakawaki in the
in the video, and it's actually very similar to what something my mom makes, which is caldo de res, which is like beef stew. But in caldo de res they add vegetables, and in guacamole they only add it's basically like beef broth and just the meat. So that's something they only serve at, well, usually they only serve at the fiestas tradicionales, which are the religious uh, practices they have. So that's one of them. They serve also menudo and pozole, which is kind of, we Mexicans also eat that, but I feel like those are usually the three types of food that are typically served during those events.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Brizela. Okay. We'll have Maisie, Georgia, and Samaya come up. Thanks, guys.
It's like a press conference.
Okay, first we have Samaya. Her project is called Cultivating Kinship, U.S. Mothers' Motivations to Adopt Female Orphans from India. And Samaya, yes, just tell us a little bit about your project.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Samaya Joshi, and my project was on why American mothers, kind of gives it away from the title, why American mothers adopt Indian female orphans. So a little bit of background on this is ever since I was little, I always have wanted to adopt a girl from India. This is just something that I've always had in my mind as I was growing up. I can go into a little bit more why later, but basically as I was doing this project, I was researching, and I saw that there wasn't a lot of information on same culture adoption, and also not a lot of information on why specifically the adopter adopts, so more so the adopter perspective, whereas there was a lot of adoptee perspective. So that's why from my research I decided to interview a cluster of non-Indian heritage mothers, but then also a cluster of Indian heritage mothers, all born in the United States, all grew up in the United States, and I explored basically why they wanted to adopt specifically female orphans from India.
Okay, first question for Samaya. In the back.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in terms of, sorry, I'm completely blank.
That's okay.
I did have a question though.
That's okay. No, you can think about it. Maybe it'll come back.
It literally just slipped my mind. Yes, okay. Methods. So in your research kind of video, you said that you did semi-structured interviews. And you had to shift a little bit from, American culture mothers to like same culture mothers, like who are culturally Indian, right? How did your methods also kind of shift, or did they stay the same? Did you find anything interesting whilst doing semi-structured interviews? Thoughts on that?
So originally when I started my project, my main goal was actually just to interview the Indian American mothers. I didn't have any intention of interviewing non-Indian heritage mothers, but as I kind of went through, I was like, maybe I should interview more mothers just for comparison purposes. And in terms of actually interviewing, my methods never changed. I really went in there and was like, tell me your story about adoption. I want to hear all about it. I want to hear what were your thoughts, what was the process, all of that. So in actually doing my interviews, the process really didn't change. I think the main thing that did change is actually finding my participants. So I really had to do like a deep dive internet search, because when I started this, I only knew Indian heritage mothers that had adopted. I didn't know any non-Indian heritage mothers that did. So I said this in my video, but I ended up joining a lot of private Facebook groups, private support Facebook groups, where a lot of these mothers, are asking for support. And one of the interesting things I did find in doing that methods was that there were many, many non-Indian heritage mothers that adopted children with special needs, physical disabilities, mental disabilities, whereas a lot of the actual Indian heritage mothers, they went into their adoption process and they said, we want a healthy baby, and that goes into another thing, whereas where in India, in the orphanages, they don't have a lot of resources. A lot of them are very poor. They don't have proper health care. So really, actually, majority of the orphans in India do have significant health problems. And a lot of the time, that information doesn't necessarily translate to the parents in the United States who are trying to adopt them. But it seemed to be almost a understanding from all of these mothers that the non-Indian heritage mothers were the ones that went seeking children who had disabilities because they believed they could, really help them. So when I did a lot of my research on where I could find these non-Indian participants, a lot of them came from those non-Indian heritage mothers asking for support with their child's physical or mental disability. So I think that was hopefully an interesting aspect of that.
Nancy online. Nancy.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yes, I love you. Hi. Where's the camera?
So I have a question, because when I heard about this project, you were only going to adopt Indian mothers, Indian people who had been born in or affiliated with India by ethnicity. So, but my question is different. What my question is did you see any changes depending on the age of the adoptee? And was your sample structured in such a way that you could tell that sort of difference?
Yeah, so I would say with the younger adopters, so I'm just going to say the younger mothers who had adopted younger kids. So I had a large range. I had moms who adopted 10 years ago, and I also had moms who adopted 1 year ago or 2 years ago. So I think a big difference is that in 2017, there became a new set of regulations in India through in the adoption system for how you could adopt. So before 2017, it wasn't a standardized process. It was actually a very messy, difficult, long process, a lot of individual work in that sense. So I think the experiences of the younger adopters were much different than the experiences of the older adopters, just in the way they actually went about the process of adopting and it was also a mental thing. I asked how how they felt during the process. And for a lot of the moms who adopted more recently, their mental state in the process of adoption was a lot better than the ones who are the older mothers. Yeah.
I suggest you write a paper on this.
Okay. There's lots more to write about, for sure. Thank you, Professor.
I think there was one more. Oh, okay, yes.
Question. You mentioned you're focused on the women and the families that are adopting girls, specifically because there's awareness of this underappreciation of girls in India, the infants. I'm curious whether any of these families also adopted boys, or the families that you worked with, they explicitly were looking for girls and that's all they were looking for?
Yeah, so that was interesting too. So girls in India make up a very, very large majority of the orphans there. And that's due to many things. It's mostly due to a very strong patriarchal history there, patriarchal practices. It just contributes to having a lot of girls in the adoption system. And that's comes to one of my main findings, were a lot of the Indian American mothers, they had a collective understanding, a collective knowledge of this, and that specifically motivate them to adopt an Indian girl. None of the Indian American participants that I interviewed adopted boys. It was all very much specifically girls, and that was my main finding, is that they had a very strong cultural motivation to adopt, on top of other motivations, of course, but that was a strong motivation, whereas the non-Indian heritage mothers, they had many motivations, but none of them explicitly knew about that patriarchal history in India like the Indian American mothers did.
Unfortunately, we have no more time. I'm so sorry. but there'll be time afterwards. Sorry.
This is such a beautiful topic.
Oh. You want to read it? What is the?
It's just a very nice comment. The person says this is such a beautiful topic. It makes sense because because of gender inequality in India, this is literally the dream for every Indian family.
Oh. Thank you. Next up, we have Maisie, and Maisie's project is called The Business of Identity. exploring the dissonant landscape of personal identity for non-male artists in the indie music industry. Maisie, can you tell us about your project?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Maisie Green. For my research, I looked at personal identity in the indie music industry, in particular the ways in which artists are able to use music making to understand and express their authentic selves, and how there's a conflict between that and the need to, in capitalism, to market oneself in order to make a profit off of one's work.
Yeah. Okay, first question. Tim.
Good job, Maisie.
Thank you.
I have lots of questions, but I have your email.
You do.
I think the one I'd like to ask is about what happens when, which does happen, what happens when an indie artist signs with a major label and then they become, something else?
Yeah.
What does that do to their conception or presentation of identity as you discussed?
That's interesting. So, no one I spoke to, was in that circumstance, but something that's, unique about indie labels and the indie music industry, which is why it, draws a particular type of artist, is that it kind of innately allows for a bit more space in terms of, difference of expression. So it allows for, slightly more alternative music sound and ways of presentation. And on a bigger scale, there's less room for that. If you look at, all the biggest artists, they're all pretty conventionally attractive, and they're all pretty white, and they're all, there's, certain sounds that they have. So I would assume that it kind of just further even restricts the ability to present oneself, more so than it does even in the indie music industry. Yeah.
So your video was another one that stood out to me a lot, especially where you dressed up like Michelle Foucault.
Yeah.
So I want to know, what inspired the way that you this information? Why did you take that more kind of lighthearted comedic approach, and how did it relate to the studies you did?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for noting my Foucault impression. So honestly, going into it, knowing that we had to make a video, I kind of just wanted to have fun with it. I feel like there are some deeper implications to my project, but in comparison to a lot of other people's projects, especially this year, mine is pretty lighthearted. So I feel like if anyone was appropriately gonna have fun with it, it would be me. So I kind of just wanted to have fun, and I thought the idea of a mini docu-film rather than a presentation video just kind of sounded fun. And then obviously the only natural way to present Michelle Foucault's research is to become Michelle Foucault. So yeah, that's how that happened.
Yes, in the back.
I find that indie artists have to do a lot of their own self-promotion through social media.
Yeah.
How did you find them kind of negotiating that space? How do they think about that differently from having to amend their art to fit label expectations? How is that different in regards to social media?
I think a lot of that. So for indie artists, they typically do, like you said, run their own accounts and everything. Whereas a bigger artist, it's all all their posts are being done for them. I think it's interesting because there is this image that a label is pushing on someone, / also just it kind of naturally happens oh, when I post a picture where I look like this, that gets more likes because it's more liked, literally. So I think there is if to post and express oneself how the individual wants, but again, it kind of naturally if you're trying to make a career in music, you need to get fans and make money and everything, and in order to do that, people need to like you, and to get people to like you, you have to present a certain way. So it kind of, I feel just plays into the whole thing more, but I don't know. Yeah, they also have smaller followings typically, so it's does it matter as much? It's hard. It's hard. I feel like it's kind of case to case. Yeah.
What I'm hearing is like these indie artists, you know, are able to express themselves authentically through their music, and then there are some restrictions to those, like, you know, marketing yourself in a likable way,
Yeah.
or restrictions that might be imposed by, you know, when one signs to a label. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you know, how much of like the restrictions come from, you know, the first thing versus the other, and also if you've noticed like a difference among your participants in terms of how much they, I don't know, conform to those,
Mhm.
like the unsigned artists, like how
Yeah.
much they conform to those like likability standards in terms of
Yeah.
marketing themselves, you know.
Yeah. So for my participants, everyone I spoke to was actually signed to the same label, which is a small label that I intern at a label, and that's how I was able to get in contact with these people. So I can't necessarily speak for people not signed to a label, but within that label there are big gaps in like number of monthly listeners or like popularity levels. So the label itself, I was fortunate enough to get on board with a label that's very artist first, and like ultimately everything they do, they won't force an artist to put anything out that they don't like sign off on and don't want to be put out. But a lot of them spoke about their past experiences with other labels and how it like led them to leaving those labels because they're trying to change the sound of your album. And to an extent, that's what the label is for. It's like a management, and they're funding it and everything. But when it's getting to a point where it's like you have to look a certain way, we can't have you posting these videos where you're wearing that kind of outfit because they don't perform as well as the ones where you're dressed like this or whatever. That, I guess, is where the pressure is coming from the label. But then, larger scale, like, that label pressure is coming from social factors that are causing, like, the particular image to be what's liked. I hope that answers. Okay, cool.
Yes, last question.
You talk a lot in your video about how, like, even though the indie genre affords like a certain like alternative look for a lot of like queer presenting artists or even more like alternatively presenting artists, they have to compromise that for their audiences.
Yeah.
When you talk to your participants, do they express a sort of like discontent with this sacrifice?
Yeah. One participant in particular spoke a lot about how there is like this very clear so this artist is like their music is sad and it's like they just fit into a very particular musical trope, which like most of the artists under that trope do look a certain way, and it's very like feminine and it's very like I said before, like conventionally attractive, and this person is a non-binary like artist, so they like are still being spoken about as like this feminine figure, and like their music is like related to sad girl music and everything, but they're not a girl. So it's like these labels, not like record labels, like labels that are ascribed to people, kind of limit the way that a person's allowed to express themselves, and can even like put a category on an artist, which I think is overall with my participants something that was an issue. That yeah, like the ways that media or that labels refer to an artist, it's like constricting because it doesn't necessarily encompass all of what a person wants, but you need like a quick tagline in order to sell yourself. Yeah.
Hence the contradiction.
Exactly.
Thank you, Maisie. Okay, now we have Georgia. Her project is called Navigating Liminality in Paradise. searching for psychological well-being through work trade in the midst of Maui's disintegration. Okay, Georgia.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so that's my title, and I guess just to kickstart off, I talk about this in the beginning of my video, and it's a really important part of, why I even started, wanted to create this project and create a proposal and everything. But so I was here in 2019 before COVID hit and everything, and I'd love to tell this little story just because I was here. I was on campus, and I was extremely miserable. I was incredibly depressed. I was deeply struggling with mental health. I had a roof over my head. I had education in front of me. I had people, I have a family, my mother, my sister here right now. I had a family that was like backing me to the nines, and I was just like, what is up? I have access to therapy, and all of it. And then of course, lo and behold, the timing, 2020 rolls around, and COVID hits, and we're actually all sent home. And so we're sent home during this time, and I think, I took a fat breath of air, and I was like, yeah, something's wrong. Like, I don't think I can be in school anymore, and ended up pulling out of school, and that is where work trade comes into the picture. And work trade, how I would define it, is an exchange of, like, skills and, like, time, basically. You're a volunteer, and what you get in return is basic accommodations, basic needs, food and water and housing. And so I embarked on a journey with work trade the entire year that I took off from school. And I'm a major city girl. I've moved around quite a bit. I've lived in a lot of cities, and I've not spent a lot of time in the outdoors. And a lot of work trade opportunities are rooted in kind of an experience of kind of community building, you get a lot of young people, but also you get all kinds of people. You do get a lot of young people. And so I was noticing all these things. And I come back after my year, and I've come back to school. I'm an anthro major, and I decided, like, this is something I think I really want to understand. And so my project is basically trying to understand why these young adults in particular, because I want to look at the post-pandemic context. I want to look at the, context of a very, technologically fluid world post-pandemic as well, and I personally went to Hawaii. I went to Maui Island, and I went to Hana on the east side, and I was there for 4 months, and that was the farm that I ended up returning to conduct my ethnography and everything like that. So I went back this past summer, and it was an experience that was unexpected because of also the fires that occurred. So the fires, the wildfires, which is the most horrific wildfire in the U.S. in over 100 years, occurred probably 2 days after I arrived. And, imagine thinking like, yeah, okay, like, what am I doing here with my little research? What's the point? And I think that, of course, is, if you saw my video, you can ask whatever questions or not, just watch, but that all really, all those different things compounded together, and I was like, wow, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to be said just about the way our world is going in, the direction, the young people, the support we need, and the different kind of routes that I think we really need to take into understanding different paradigm shifts for learning, success, and work, and what are the different options we can have for ourselves. And through all of that, the most important thing is knowing how to build this personal framework for psychological well-being, which I talk about, which is how do you take care of yourself so that you can be here for the people around you. But please, questions. You don't have to ask a question. No.
Yeah, so if you were going to go, we haven't asked this question for a while, if you were going to take this further and do more investigations, where would you take this towards a comparative study of other, work trade? Would you follow young people from work trade into the paid workforce? Was it about Hawaii? Would you, where would you take this, what you've learned now, how would you build on it and take it in another direction?
Phenomenal question from Dr. Lesher, who absolutely helped me and pushed me to answer this question, of course. In writing the thesis, we get, 35 pages, is it? And everyone's starting from somewhere, and there was so much in Hawaii was, I think in going back this time around and with the fires, big thing in anthropology is not just, of course, positionality and going out to do field work, but when you're going somewhere, what's happening in front of you? It's not like, let me get mine and then dip, it's a very important experience to be there. And I was unfortunately, there at a time when there was the utmost tragedy for a community that is already ridden with quite a bit of tragedy, rooted in, of course, in the colonial
aspects of Hawaii becoming what it is today and everything, and it being this notion of paradise that I also refer to. So I think in answering your question, I wanted to focus on Hawaii for this paper, and I think there's so much also there to use it kind of as like a very like fertile space for work trade, and also a very, it has a really robust history, of course, of, I think, tourism, and work trade can't be talked about without the conversation of tourism and travel, because even though you're not a tourist, you're still an outsider. You're making your way in. You're making your way into a place that you're visiting and learning how to experience. So I wanted to focus on Hawaii because I wanted to honor also what had happened in front of me. I'm not going to go all, I was like, this is what happened in front of me. This is providing me like an incredible opportunity to study how young adults are also, navigating this liminal transitional period of time in their lives, and then also doing that amongst other reminders of our world doing it as well constantly with climate change and all of that. But to down the line, I would love to go to graduate school and look more into, though, the young adult aspect and kind of maybe like a comparative study, but obviously it's like you could go anywhere. There's a lot of work trade anywhere. And so I guess like beginning with Hawaii and understanding, I guess, these paradisiacal destinations, because those are the places that are hit first. Those are the places that are visited first. And those are the places that, it burns down, it's charred, they're forgotten even first a lot of the times. You know what I mean? It's like, whoa, it's only been a year since this happened, and it's something that, I know, of course, like there's so much happening in our world, but it's a piece of land that has been time and time again been abused in that way and so I think like my heart is there in a lot of ways now, and especially in the community I've built, but there's so many different directions to go in, but starting there, yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi. I was curious, how does gaining a connection with community and sustainability continue when people finish with the liminal space of work trade? What are they taking with them? And if you had any follow-up with people that you interviewed with kind of how they're now living their life after having the experience in work trade?
Thank you, Noah, for that question. Actually, it's quite relevant. So Noah and I, we do jujitsu together. That's how we met. And it seems random, but it's quite relevant just because for me, when you think about even doing work trade, it's very outdoorsy. It's like, one can even use the word granola to describe it. You have access to a lot of, like, I probably camped for the first time solidly. I learned how to backpack, sort of. A lot of things, I was gardening. I was out here gardening, guys. Like, I was farming. I was weed whacking. I was using, I was doing all these things, and I was like, okay, like what's transferable, which is why I kind of used, this terminology of a framework for psychological well-being, because what I extracted, my framework personally, what I saw a lot of people included in their own framework was, inherently this community building, bonding experience, where it's like, no matter where I go, I know that I want to be, if I know where I'm at in life, I know I want to be amongst other people who care about reaching a similar goal, even if it's in completely different directions, and honoring that with each other. And where do I go afterwards? Where do I find kind of those kinds of people, no matter where I go? Where do I find maybe even people with similar, like, moral groundings or whatnot? And maybe that's somehow connected to the outdoors. But so a lot of the, and specifically it was all young women who were on my most recent team, but they've all since, everyone is actually very much still connected. We had one work trader who performed a little bit of an Irish goodbye and actually left the scene, and that happened during the fires, and that's a whole other, result and finding of how different people react to chaos and kind of make decisions in that way. But a lot of people are actually doing a lot of things related to the outdoors, maybe not directly. So I know two girls who are still farming. One girl from my last work trade team, she went to University of Vermont, like, specifically for farming. We've had people who were taking time off from even, like, a really corporate lifestyle and just learned, like, a couple new tools to sort of reintroduce this really beautiful time of their life. And why was it beautiful? It's not just because you're in Hawaii. It's like, what can you do about it in the space that you're in, from, like, taking a walk? And then even what, Deanna, you were talking about, of, like, looking at the space that you're in, though. Not everyone has the opportunity to just pop out and go on a beautiful hike, so it's like, what was it about, you know, maybe the work hard, play hard, or the ability to have a conversation with someone, or to cook a meal with someone, or, you know, what can we extract from that? And then for me, I was like, I know that I need to be moving actually all the time. I loved the like field work aspect and being outside. I need to be moving a lot more, and somehow that actually has like resulted in jujitsu. Like my cohort look at me like, of course she found a way to like weasel in talking about that. Like I'm even shocked up here, but yeah, but seriously, of just like that's something where it's a tool, you know, in that self-love toolbox of just like it's not me being outside. I'm not gonna be a farmer, maybe, you know, but shoot, I can talk for a long time. So,
Yeah,
you know,
there's
yeah.
actually like questions online, questions
bad.
here, but we're running out of time,
Sorry.
and so hopefully those who have questions can ask Georgia afterwards.
I'll be
Thanks,
here.
Georgia,
I'll
and
be
thanks
here.
all.
Yeah.
We're gonna do the last group. Okay, Tiana and Jesse, come on up. This is our last. We have a last group of 2. All right. We might go over 5 minutes, guys, so just hang in there, please. Okay. Oh my goodness. First up, we're gonna have Jesse. His project is called Gender, Race, and Nationality: Experiences of Highly Skilled West African Migrant Women Living in France. All right, Jesse, what was your project about?
Hi, my name is Jesse Ontiveros, and my project was about migrant women who they had traveled to France to pursue higher education. They received bachelor's and master's degrees in the fields that they had pursued in Ivory Coast, where they were from. And my project was originally going to be about cocoa farmers in Ivory Coast, but at the time I was doing my research. When I was working with the TA, we were talking about more feasible projects, and I was just learning French, and we thought it would be easier to do a project in France. So rather than working with the farmers, I decided to go to France, and I was going to work with undocumented migrants living in Paris. And because of the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, problems that might arise with working with undocumented people in another country, we decided to work with documented migrants. So my project completely changed, and I ended up learning about some folks that were pretty interesting because they're part of this niche of very, very well-educated folks who are living abroad and in high-position jobs. And while they do well, they don't do as well as I think they should. So anyway, that's the gist of my project.
Okay. First question for Jesse.
I got a question for you, Jesse. So you talk about the ambivalence that a lot of the people you talk to experience, being sort of betwixt and between. Can you tell us a little bit more about the nature of that ambivalence, what it is why they stay in France, why they resist going home?
Yes, well, firstly they do return. It's more of a circular migration that they're going through, where they go back and forth because they have the freedom to go back and forth. Both the women that I worked with, and I initially I didn't think I was going to be able to work with women, to be honest with you, because of gender barriers, but the women were the ones who were open to working with me, and the men were too busy. But the ambivalence came from, they had come to France to get better educations, and then to continue, they wanted to keep rising up the ladder of the socioeconomic ladder, and so they felt that they needed to get more work experience. So they got very good jobs with international corporations and felt like they needed to stay in order to go back and start their own businesses or to work for other companies and get that kind of high-level job. But what ends up happening is they've gotten used to the lifestyle in France, and stay there. Yet whenever I talk to them, they miss home, but then they go home and they want to go back. So the ambivalence comes from kind of living in both places. And when I was reading Ghassan Hajj's work, he talks about this idea of when a person is in a situation like that, they're here thinking about the other place. So go back to Ivory Coast, and then after 2 weeks, thinking back about the food in Paris, and their family or their girlfriend, or because your life becomes where you live. So that was where the ambivalent stayed. But the wanting to be home had a lot to do with family, and being rooted in the culture of, French culture is really kind of closed, and Ivorian culture is very, very, they're very hospitable, very friendly people. So, yeah. I'll start with Mom.
Why did you choose France? Did it have anything to do with your heritage?
Yeah. Well, you just gave it away. That's my mom. France. Yeah, I mean, like that's part of, my research was about, I wanted to go to West Africa partially because my grandfather would travel all over the world, and France, Africa was one of the places that always intrigued me, but France also because my grandmother was part French, and so I wanted to learn more about the culture. And when I said I wanted to go to West Africa and study West Africa, I actually got introduced to anthropology in community college, and my professor there said, well, if you're going to study West African culture, you better learn French. And so I ended up taking French classes here, and then the French department was going to Paris, and so it all just worked out, and it's been my dream. So yeah.
Did it have anything to do with Pontcoupé Parish?
Oh yeah. My grandma was from.
You chose?
Yeah, definitely. So my grandmother was from. Our heritage goes all the way back to the very first parish in Louisiana. So my ancestors came here as the first immigrants from France to Louisiana. Yeah. Point Coupé Parish.
Courtney.
Courtney.
It's been really wonderful to see how your research has evolved over time, and I'm just curious if you would share in the future these two women that you've maintained relationships with. It would be a great opportunity for a longitudinal study. Is that something that you are looking to do in your next chapter?
What is your next chapter?
I just got accepted to American University for the School of International Studies, and I'm doing master's degree in international and intercultural communication. And one of the professors there does studies on African migrants living in France. And so I'm going to continue the work with her and with them, and I plan to go to Africa. So I would just talk to them, and what I really want to do is I want to go to Ivory Coast and learn more about where they're from and what ties them to both places, to learn more about it. So yeah.
So I enjoyed the video, and I'm wondering if you found that being Francophone African in France kind of leveled off regional or national differences in West Africa. I mean, did people from Cote d'Ivoire say, oh, you're Senegalese, I'm not going to talk to you, or I am going to talk to you because now we all speak French and local languages don't matter anymore?
Great question, actually, and what it did was, because they are natural enemies, it became a neutralizer for the people from West Africa. So, for example, one of my participants, her boyfriend is from Cameroon, and Cameroon and Cote d'Ivoire are they're the enemies, especially when it comes to soccer and food. They always are competing to say who has the best food. But she actually said that we're enemies, but we are friends. So it actually makes it. What one of the other participants said was that it made them learn more about each other's cultures that they wouldn't have learned about otherwise. So it kind of broadened who they were as Africans, and that's why I brought in the topic of Pan-Africanism, because it was very much about the bigger African picture since they were outside of their home. Yeah.
Last question.
When you were researching and speaking with your participants, how do they deal with the prejudices and I'm kind of very familiar with France, the prejudice and the racism? How do they handle that coming from Africa? Because there are groups in that area that are not as welcoming as other groups. Did you discuss that with them? Is this anything that you witnessed or anything that they had to deal with?
I didn't witness it personally. However, they spoke about it as, for them, first of all, they're super resilient. They didn't seem fazed by that, but they did say it was a barrier. So basically, both of the women that I worked with said that they had to work doubly hard to prove that they were as good as the people who didn't have the accolades that they had. So, and one thing that I asked them was if there was a glass ceiling for them, and they didn't feel that there was, but they did feel that they just had to work extra hard because of their race, because of their gender, because of their nationality, and because of their culture.
Thanks, Jesse.
Sure.
Okay, and last up, we have Tiana. Her project is called What the Enemy Wants, Resisting Diasporic Disconnection in Armenian Identity and Belonging. All right, tell us about your project.
Hi, everyone. So my project was essentially exploring the narratives of Armenian diasporans living in LA. So that's including people who were born in Los Angeles, but also people who immigrated. And they're all of Armenian heritage. And I was wondering what their experiences were of connection and disconnection, belonging and disbelonging within Armenian diasporan communities here. Specifically using the framework of collective memory to understand. So collective memory is basically a framework that was developed, and the way that it's applied here is I found that Armenian diasporans all kind of have this like textbook understanding of what it means to be Armenian and what the obligation that comes with that is to our culture, given the history of genocide and given ongoing struggles that Armenians undergo in the homeland. So, yeah.
Derek, first question.
Hi, I'm curious about, my question is kind of a split question about heritage. So you mentioned that your participants have this common understanding of what their identity means to them, or at least what their identity is and how the history of the Armenian people, especially genocide, plays a role in that. So I want to ask, first of all, how is this collective memory formed? If you could talk a little bit more about the mechanisms of the formation of this kind of collective memory. Is it through school? Is it through church? Is it through community gatherings or family? And secondly is, with your participants, what is the age range like for your participants? And do they also have this feeling that they are part of this something bigger and that they have to do their part to carry on the legacy of their people and their heritage?
Those are both great questions. I'll answer the second one first. So the sample that I had, originally I was planning to go with people between ages of 18 and 30. I was not going with anybody under 18 because of IRB approval. And I was thinking that people over 30 are not going through like crazy identity transformation. And so I was gonna say like young adults are the ones undergoing that. But inevitably found that that's not the case, was proved wrong, that people are still going through identity transformation throughout their lifetime. So I expanded it and it became anybody over the age of 18. So my youngest participants, the youngest one I believe was 18 and the oldest one was in his 50s. And As for the mechanisms of developing collective memory, I think in each person, I saw differences in how they came to know things that I call like this handbook or this manual on Armenianness. Because some of them were, two of my participants are immigrants. One of them was born in the Republic of Armenia, and so I feel like she was surrounded by Armenianness growing up, and so I feel like that's where she gained her cultural consciousness from. Versus another person was born in Iran, and there's a thriving ethnic enclave of Armenians in Iran. They're the largest religious and ethnic minority in Iran, and so they kind of live in communities close to one another. And as minorities, they also band together in order to overcome marginalization. So with him in particular, I feel like his understanding of Armenianness came from being in a really close-knit community and neighborhood of other Armenians, despite being in a country that's not Armenia. As for the ones that were born here, it varied. Two of my participants went to Armenian-dominated schools, like schools that had relatively big Armenian student populations. One of them went to an Armenian school. Her parents specifically enrolled her in that school so that she would learn Armenian growing up. And so I feel like in that case, it was like education that played a really big role. But then others, two of my participants did not have that, and those are the ones who felt the most disconnected from their cultural identity. But yet I still found that they had this textbook understanding of what Armenianness meant and what they felt the duty that was expected of them was. And so, truthfully, I think with them, in not growing up in like a thriving Armenian community, in not having necessarily traditions honored in the home, in not practicing the language, I don't know where their collective memory comes from, because that's like the mind-boggling thing for me, is I don't know what is bringing these notions of how to serve your community or how to be a good Armenian come from if you're not exposed to it all the time as a kid. I just found that the level of connection to that identity, the level of connection to community and the feelings of belonging within community would decrease if you didn't have regular exposure. But regardless of the level of exposure, people still knew about Armenianness, and whether that's by educating themselves. Like one of my participants, he told me that he grew up feeling very disconnected from his cultural identity, and over a summer it like changed overnight. He said he became so sympathetic to his Armenian side, he bought a book called How to Learn and Read Armenian in 5 days, and he did it in a summer, and he taught himself how to read and write in Armenian. He was like, I'm very proud of this fact. Like I fully, like, I asked him, like, do you credit like your family for your knowledge of the culture, or do you credit, and he's like, no, it's all me, like I did it. He was like, I had to go out and search for this information, and I had to teach myself. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I have a question about solidarity. Well, first off, like, super powerful work, like, just did an incredible job. Your video may or may not have made me cry. And you talk about solidarity, this, global connectedness of, people's struggles against a common enemy, whether that's, framed as U.S. imperialism or like neoliberalism or whatever you want to call it. And I'm curious about how prevalent that topic of solidarity was in your conversations with your participants. I'm also curious about when it caught your attention as a topic relevant to your research.
I would say that in the course of the interviews, an important fact to mention is that I completed my interviews over this summer, and then as soon as the summer was over, major developments happened abroad in Armenia, and this is between Armenia and its neighboring country Azerbaijan, and their conflict over this independent territory called Artsakh, where 95% of the population was ethnically Armenian, and Azerbaijan was claiming essentially ownership over this land. And so that resulted in eventually this year, the first day of this year, January 1st, 2024, the dissolution of that independent republic and the displacement of all of the Armenians living there. So that happened, that like up flare in the conflict started immediately after the interviews concluded. And so it's not that we didn't talk about Artsakh during the interviews, but it wasn't as important of a topic at that point in time. And so that definitely got me thinking about it after the interviews concluded. Of course, our own campus, in the past couple months, everything that's been going on, the protests and what's happening overseas, it's been heavy on my mind, especially as somebody who is coming from knowing that somewhere down the line my ancestors had to have survived a genocide in order for me to be here. And knowing that things similar to that nature are still happening today, I felt the need to talk about it. But I would say that something I've noticed is that within Armenian communities, there's definitely solidarity. I mean, I include in my video like clear images of that, like the Armenian flag and other flags flying together. But at the same time, there's also a lot of ignorance. I think there's a lot of conversations I've had in the past month or two with Armenians about what's going on in the world right now, and a lot of people actually don't understand how our histories are intertwined. They don't know that there's an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, and so people of our own heritage are being affected by what's going on today. I think overall, something that this project has taught me is that I can't be afraid of speaking out about things that I feel are aligned with my own morals, even if it's not about my own people. Yeah.
Okay, last question of the conference.
I'm curious about how far the sense of identity in Armenianness goes. I mean, do people feel, for example, that they ideally marry within the community? What does that raise for some of your interviewees and for some of the families?
Yeah, definitely. I think honestly, the conceptualization of this project was born out of that in my own upbringing and in my community, knowing how Armenian communities kind of operate, is that there's this collective understanding that we are descendants of survivors, and therefore our numbers are few. There's this famous quote, "We are few, but we are Armenian," that is like disseminated through, like every single Armenian has it. Like by the time you're 5, you know how to say that in Armenian. And so as a result of that, there is this survivalist mindset that happens no matter where you're born. It's like, I see it a lot in diasporans who immigrate to the United States, but I also see it in people who grew up here, where there's this sense of obligation to your culture and to your heritage that because we're so few, we have to create more of us, and we have to create little Armenias everywhere. Little Armenia isn't that far from here. And so as a result of that, people do unite across different refugee experiences. Like one of my participants, he was born in Iran, so he's Persian Armenian, he's Iranian Armenian, and his wife is Lebanese Armenian. And so they speak different dialects, they have different accents, they have different like understandings of their histories because they grew up in different places, and yet they still feel united by the fact that they're Armenian, and so they feel empowered in raising their children as Armenians. But at the same time, it becomes, the problem arises when you're growing up in a place like the United States, when you're growing in a place that's so diverse, and as you become acculturated, you see beauty in other cultures as well, and so conflict and tension happens when your duty or your obligation to your culture conflicts with the people that you actually end up wanting to be associated with, the people that you actually love, the people that you actually want to spend time with, and so you can't fulfill that obligation. But I will say, to and on like a more positive note, I do think that even though Armenian communities have historically been like very closed off to other cultures and maybe become exclusionary in some ways, at the same time there's definitely like strides in our generation specifically to create organizations and nonprofits and companies that are trying to highlight the diversity and intersectionality of Armenian experiences here. It's not just about being Armenian, it's about being Armenian American, it's about being a person of color in the United States, it's about having a religion that you don't see represented when you live in a country like Iran or Lebanon. It's about a lot more when you come here and there's people around you that you are gravitated towards, and they're not necessarily from your same culture, they don't speak your same language, but you can find beauty in sharing your culture with them and learning about theirs as well.
We'll end there. Tiana, thank you so much. I just also want to give you the chance to say what you're doing next.
What am I doing next? So I will be starting a master's program here at UCLA in social welfare in a year. I have deferred admission for a year to work full-time with the LA Community College District.
Okay, thank you guys, thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for your incredible questions and for the students' beautiful responses with such poise. I want to thank once more Rob Lemelson, Jason Troop, Doug Holland, Omar Boom, Lemelson faculty advisors and TAs, staff, the staff who's made it happen, and family and friends. And last but not least, I want to thank you, my dear Lemelson students, seniors, for your perseverance and your beautiful support of one another to push each other through to the end. You've made it. And doing true justice to the research you have conducted over the past few years. You have made me very proud, not only as your professor, you have also made me proud to be an anthropologist, because you are shedding light on issues we need to pay more attention to in this world. And I've said this before, Lemelson scholars, and there's a lot here today, truly give me hope in this crazy world of ours. Best of luck as you graduate and head into the world. I have no doubt each of you will do incredible things to make a difference. Amazing job today. Huge kudos for all the work you've done over these last couple of years. Congratulations. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Zoom.